I apologize. Okay, perfect. I apologize. Choose this way of screen sharing. I cannot see anything except for my slides. So if you have to interrupt me or something is happening, please just talk because I will not be able to see anything except the slides. Good evening, everyone. I'm Bernado Paci. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Naples. I thank Luke for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here, although virtually. And I'll just say a couple of things before starting. My well, I'll say that disability studies are not my main field of research because my primary research work concerned critical theory and postcolonial studies, broadly construed. But since the theme of neurodiversity is being increasingly discussed in the public sphere, both progressively, thanks to the growing movements of neurodivergent people, and also, unfortunately, as an instrument of far-right propaganda, as a researcher and an autistic person myself, in the last years, I have growingly felt the responsibility to speak and to give my contributions to the movements for liberation. So this is a work in progress. The research I'm presenting is a work in progress. I'm still reflecting very much on this issue, but I still hope it will be clear even in the present state, as it is a part of my effort to give a contribution in this direction. So I'll be very happy after the presentation itself to hear from you to know if you have questions and comments and opinions and so on. So I'll start. Perhaps I haven't said that much about myself, but I'd say I'll start without further ado. So this is a simple scheme of what I'm going to say. The point of departure of this research has been the recognition that, which is not that original, far from being a neutral medical classification, the concept of autism has been constituted through a confluence of philosophical, scientific, and colonial discourses. And that it has been framed in terms of, and this is my hypothesis, in terms of temporal and developmental differences. In particular, what I have tried to do here is an attempt to reconstruct the historical constitution of autism by critiquing its formation through a postcolonial lens, examining how it has been positioned as an atavistic or primitive condition within the medical and the philosophical and psychopathological discourse, a sort of past in the present, a concept that, just like provincialization, which is part of the title, I borrow from Dipesh Chakrabarty. In this way, what I'm trying to do is to contribute to the deconstruction of the dominant neurotypical framework that have historically marginalized autistic and more broadly neurodivergent experiences, proposing a radical decentering of neurotypicality, as by the title, a provincialization of it. So, drawing upon Chakrabarty's critique of Western historicism, I argue that the positioning of autism as a premodern or archaic condition mirrors the colonialist practice of relegating colonized people to an imaginary waiting room of history or of development, if we prefer. And by expanding this critique to the realm of neurodivergence, I contend that the understanding of autism as temporally and developmentally segregated fundamentally limits the recognition of autistic experiences as fully modern and coeval with neurotypicality. Therefore, what I'm saying is that neuronormativity, to use another concept from this galaxy, somehow that does not simply act, I would say, in a simple present, but in a sort of a stratification of historical times, whereas different forms of neurodevelopment and development more broadly can be understood in the dominant discourse only by collocating them in incommensurable dimensions, historical temporal dimensions, which widen the incommensurability and the representation as alien and foreigner of somehow of neurodivergent people. So returning briefly to Chakrabarty, although he was interested with provincializing Europe in criticizing colonialist and nationalist accounts of the modern political subject in India, he himself had suggested that any critic of this time would not be of this kind would not be possible without questioning the nature of historical time. And so it is necessary, even in the present case, following this thread, to criticize the assumption of a unique and linear time, as long as it also implies a unique and linear development of the human mind, and body, one could add, and its functioning. So in such a scheme, other neurotypes are instead necessarily read as earlier stages of human history. I'll try to demonstrate that this has been done systematically since a long time, be it natural or social history. And so as living fossils, forms of past in the present, atavistic remnants of other ages, that is ultimately premodern. So in order to restore the full historicity and modernity, so to say, to neurodivergent subjectivities, it is necessary to provincialize, as said, neurotypicality. That is, to decenter it in our understanding of the plurality of human minds, neurotypes, and neurological functionings. In other words, it is necessary, as mentioned, to stop treating neurotypicality as neuronormative. That is, as if it were the fundamental measure of every possible human experience. Using the word normality in an improper sense, we need to invent neurodivergent normalities. But that's a bit, perhaps it's misunderstandable. I'll have to try a better way to say this, but I hope the sense is still clear. So I'll enter into my historical reconstruction now. As I mentioned, the earliest origins of the atavistic representations of autism are to be found well before the word itself was coined. More precisely, they are rooted in a triangular relationship constructed by philosophers since the early modern age among three figures, which are best described by Locke in this sense, what he terms the child, the savage, and the idiot. Throughout the centuries, these figures have not only been considered similar in several aspects, but even used to explain and understand each other. Discourses which put into reciprocal relationships such figures started to be produced actually along with the beginning of the European colonial expansion. For example, the Spanish humanist Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, in his effort to legitimate and justify the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the treatment of the indigenous people by the conquistadores, in his Democrates Alter, did not hesitate to write that the natives were, in his words, surpassed by the Spaniards as much as children are surpassed by adults. So this is something we find in a very early moment of modernity. Nonetheless, the first proper instance of such a triangular relationship is probably to be found precisely in the work of John Locke, more than 1 century later, the treatise by Sepúlveda. And in an essay concerning human understanding, Locke associated these three figures, children, idiots, savages, wondering, quote, what general maxims are to be found among them? What universal principles of knowledge? And he would respond that, I quote again, the notions are few and narrow, borrowed only from those objects they have had most to do with, and which have made upon their senses the frequentest and strongest impressions. A child knows his nurse and his cradle, and by degrees the playthings of a little more advanced age. And a young savage has perhaps his head filled with love and hunting according to the fashion of his tribe. But he that from a child unthought or a wild inhabitant of the woods will expect these abstract maxims and reputed principles of science will, I fear, find himself mistaken. End quote. Now, similar analogies between children, savages, and idiots, again in Locke's terminology, can be found frequently throughout the entire history of modern philosophy. For example, in Giambattista Vico, and in his The New Science, and in the Positive Philosophy by Auguste Comte. Perhaps, yeah, I can briefly read the two citations. Vico wrote that the first man gave the things they wonder that substantial being after their own ideas, just as children do, whom we see take inanimate things in their hands and play with them and talk to them as though they were living persons. It is equally beyond our power to enter into the vast imagination of those first men whose minds were not in the least abstract, refined, or spiritualized because they were entirely immersed in the senses, buffeted by the passions, buried in the body. A representation that we will find again in the history of psychopathology. This is I'm treating this as a sort of prehistory of psychopathology, if you want. While in Kant, as I put in the slide, you can find the following passage. For instance, if a child or a savage on one hand and a dog or a monkey, which is even more insulting, actually, on the other hand, were to gaze upon a watch for the first time, there would probably be, except in the manner of expression, no immediate profound diversity in the spontaneous conception that both would form. They would both regard this marvelous product of human industry as a kind of living creature with its own taste and inclinations, resulting in a fundamentally common fetishism in this regard, and the concept of fetishism will return as well. Now, Paolo Rossi, an important Italian scholar in intellectual history, has more generally shown their importance in the importance of such representations, atavistic representations of children, non-European people, and neurodivergent people throughout the entire modern philosophy of history, and particularly showing its power and diffusion in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I'm sorry for this long series of quotations. I swear that the entire presentation will not be like this, but I use them as proofs, so I hope you will forgive me. But I'll read a brief passage from its book, Bambini, Sogni, Furori, which can be translated as Children, Dreams, Frenzies. That's also for the title, I find particularly illustrative. He wrote, in the later stages or phases of individual lives and civilization, to what extent do we find traces of earlier stages or phases? How much of a child's mentality still exists in civilized adults? The inner life of the child and of the primitive is dominated by fantasy, a magical and animistic view, a belief that everything is alive. How much of that inner life survives within us? And could these residues potentially configure the basis for a process of regression? Are there individuals, such as the mentally ill, he says, who regress to childhood and primitive mentality? He's clearly describing the kind of literature he's bearing as an example. So, as for the comparison between children and non-European people, the logic behind it clearly anticipates the subsequent strong tendency to explain ontogenesis, that is, individual development, through phylogenesis, that is, species development, evolutionary history, and vice versa. Such tendency was almost hegemonic in 19th century biology, as usually remembered by referring to Ernst Haeckel's phrase, according to which ontogenesis recapitulates phylogenesis, which was extremely influential among coeval biologists, among whom we find Herbert Spencer, the founder of social Darwinism, who, with his popularity, substantially contributed to systematize and diffuse this idea throughout social sciences as well. And as a matter of fact, sorry, it's not progressing. Oh, okay. As a matter of fact, Spencer understood ontogenesis in terms of phylogenesis, whereas the latter implies for him a conflation between the biological and social evolution of human species and vice versa. So this is the passage I'm referring to. It is taken from his book, The Study of Sociology. And it says, quotes, "The process of social evolution is in its general character so far predetermined that its successive stages cannot be antedated, and that hence no teaching or policy can advance it beyond a certain normal rate, which is limited by the rate of organic modification in human beings. Yet it is quite possible to perturb, to retard, or to disorder the process. The analogy of individual developments again serves us. As between infancy and maturity, there is no shortcut by which there may be avoided the tedious process of growth and development through sensible increments, so there is no way from the lower forms of social life to the higher, but one passing through small successive modifications." Clearly, this was also a political discourse aiming to discredit socialist politics and rather sustaining conservatorism and so on. But clearly, this also has much relevance concerning the representation of society on the one hand and of the individual on the one hand and the development, clearly. Furthermore, Spencer understood racial differences between the savage and the civilized man in his terminology in the same terms in which he understood class differences, that is, as forms of arrested development, for example, of brain mass development. And I think this is a good reminder of the intersectional nature of domination and oppression. He even spoke of evolutionary regressions to explain racial, class, and developmental differences among human beings. In turn, this implied for him the inability to adapt to the natural or to the social environment, which were the same thing for him, and thus unfitness. And it is notorious how, for Spencer, only the fittest could survive. The famous phrase by Darwin, "the survival of the fittest," was actually coined by Spencer, while the unfit, in his opinion, should be let to die. As said, after all, this is the essence of the social Darwinism he first proposed. Likewise, it is also well known that Cesare Lombroso, founder of criminology and Spencer's disciple, systematically interpreted the criminal man, as he loved to say, l'uomo criminale, as well as the mentally ill, as representatives of previous stages of human evolution. That is, in terms of atavism, representing both as nearer to the primitive or the savage compared to the civilized. Obviously, these are Lombroso's terms, which were also charged with a racial content. To be clear, Lombroso even proposed a geographical line to distinguish what Italians, he was from Turin, what Italians are white and what Italians are not. And the line passed through the city of Genova. Therefore, since I am from Florence, for example, I would not be white in the system of Lombroso. And I think that his studies were also used in the United States to distinguish the grade of racial purity of Italian immigrants. But however, here clearly I'm interested in another aspect of his thought. Curiously, but again, entirely consistent with the aforementioned triangular relationship, he described also all children as criminal, saying, quote, "Savages and criminals are further alike in the impetuosity and instability of their passions. Savages have quick and violent emotions, while their strength and passions are those of adults in character, they are children." So once again, these three figures are bound together and used to explain each other. So, but I'm sorry, it is furthermore worth noting that Bloiler, the creator of the category of autism, I will discuss him in a minute, engaged with Lombroso's ideas long before coining the term autism. His first publication was titled "The Natural Born Criminal," and it was published in 1896, about 15 years before the invention of the category of autism. And he substantially shared Lombroso's thesis concerning the hereditariness of the criminal behavior and the connection between this and mental illness and the representation, so in terms of atavism. And on this basis, he was also a supporter of eugenic practices, among other things. So, in light of all of this, I think it would be naive to assume that psychopathology, at its inception in the early 20th century, could remain immune to the powerful influence of this triangular relationship and to the Hegelian theory of recapitulation. Nevertheless, since the psychopathological category of autism was in fact developed at the very beginning of the intellectual trajectory of psychopathology by Bleuler himself, the weight of this not so distant past becomes even more significant in relation to the issue of its atavistic representations. So I here pass from the prehistory, as I called it, of psychopathology to the actual early history of psychopathology. Now, the category of autism and the triangular relationship discussed so far enter the realm of psychopathology almost simultaneously, as mentioned. The term was coined by Bleuler in the article The Theory of Schizophrenic Negativism, published shortly before it was published shortly before this fact that I'm going to to say. I have written it badly. It was presented at the Third International Psychoanalytic Congress in 1911, a congress which was also attended, among the others, by Sigmund Freud and also by Carl Jung. Then, between 1912 and 1913, Bleuler published another fundamental article titled The Autistic Thinking, and Freud, incidentally, his masterpiece, Totem and Taboo, whose subtitle is, I think it already conveys the relevance of the work for the present discussion, because the subtitle is Some Points of Agreement Between the Mental Lives of Savages and the Neurotics. However, I'll return on Freud later. Originally, as quite well known, Bleuler introduced the term autism in order to describe not a separate condition, but a symptom, or better to say, an order of symptoms of what was at the time termed schizophrenia. At the same time, the first footnote of his first article, The Theory of Schizophrenic Negativism, he specified that through this word, autism, he understood practically what Freud means by autoerotism, which was in turn developed by Freud himself in association with the concept of narcissism, defined at the time as a stage in the libidinal organization and characterized by, in Freud's words, the omnipotence of thought displayed by primitive peoples and the children of today. And again, we find that this thread, this triangular relationship returns once again. Bleuler thus described autism as the tendency of schizophrenic patients to isolate themselves from reality, retreating into their own inner world and a realm of entirely subjective ideas. However, he says other grounds for negativistic conduct are also immediately identified in children, as well as, in his words, obviously, quote, in imbeciles, the deaf and dumb and partially deaf, the dream state in epileptics, and in timid or obstinate animals. And once again, I have not observed with particular attention this side of the question, but also there is a fourth point in this triangular relationship, so to say, and it is clearly the animal, because there is also a constant tendency to compare children, non-European people, and neurodivergent people, and not only with animals as well in this long line of thought. In the autistic thinking, however, Bleuler characterized the concepts with greater depth and detail. Autistic thinking is built as counterpose to logical or realistic thinking, whereas the former is conversely associated with symbolism and mythical thought. Similarly, a few years later, while discussing the famous Schreber case, Freud wrote that, quote, Jung had excellent grounds for his assertion that the mythopoetic forces of mankind are not extinct, but that to this very day they give rise in the neuroses to the same physical products as in the remotest past ages, end quote. And so, I said, everything returned. At the same time, Bloiler did not conflate simply the concept of autistic thinking with the Freudian unconscious. On the contrary, he explicitly distinguishes them, affirming that the unconscious itself can think autistically or logically. Neither, he simply reduces statistic thinking to an archaistic form of thinking, in his own words. Nevertheless, while, quote, savages can think as logically as ourselves in all the things they understand fewer things, and therefore with them the autistic thinking more frequently comes in than with us. End quote. Which implies, on the one hand, that both autistic thinking and logical thinking for Bloiler are simultaneously present in the savage and in the modern mind. However, on the other hand, it further implies that their different relevance and proportion within the human mind varies based on historical and developmental coordinates, to the point that the modern subject, characterized by the prevalence of the autistic thinking on the logical thinking, is precisely, in Bloiler's word, the modern schizophrenic. In other words, while the simple presence of forms of autistic thinking within the modern mind is not considered intrinsically atavistic by Bloiler, their prevalence compared to logical thinking is definitely atavistic in character. Now I'll return to Freud, and more exactly to totem and taboo. And also on the three essays on the theory of sexuality. But concerning totem and taboo, it is quite notorious that Freud has built all along the book an impressive series of parallels between, once again, in his words, savages and neurotics. Differently, it is known, but usually far less considered, that the relationship between ontogenesis and phylogenesis was extremely relevant in his thought, to the point that he substantially embraced the Haeckel'ian theory of recapitulation, as was highlighted from, for example, by Dominique Bourdain and also by Stephen Jay Gould. In particular, referring to Freud's own texts, Gould famously described him both as a Lamarckian, just like Herbert Spencer, incidentally, and as a recapitulationist. In Freud's words, each individual somehow recapitulates in an abbreviated form the entire development of the human race. But in the 1914 preface to the third edition of the three essays on the theory of sexuality, Freud was even more explicit on this point, saying that, quote, ontogenesis may be regarded as a recapitulation of phylogenesis insofar as the latter has not been modified by more recent experience. The phylogenetic disposition can be seen at work behind the ontogenetic process, end quote. However, this is apparent even looking at the beginning of the first chapter of Totem and Taboo, where Freud, I put in a lot of quotations, I'm sorry. He wrote, quote, prehistoric man in a certain sense is still our contemporary, but he's not saying it in a good way. There are men still living who, as we believe, stand very near to the primitive man, far nearer than we do, and whom we therefore regard as his direct heirs and representatives. Such is our view of those whom we describe as savages or half savages, and their mental life must have a peculiar interest for us if we are right in seeing in it a well-preserved picture of an early stage of our own development. If that supposition is correct, a comparison between the psychology of primitive peoples, as it is thought by social anthropology, and the psychology of neurotics, as it has been revealed by psychoanalysis, will be bound to show numerous points of agreement and will throw new light upon familiar facts in both sciences, end quote. At the same time, he wrote that the form taken by the incest taboo among savages is characterized as essentially an infantile feature, which reveals a striking agreement with the mental life of neurotic patients, he says. And so, once again, the triangular relationship between children, savages, and idiots, taking again horrendous words by John Locke, makes its reappearance here once again. Even more explicitly, still citing from Totem and Taboo, quote, neurotics who are obliged to reproduce the struggle and the taboo resulting from it may be said to have inherited an archaic constitution as an atavistic vestige. The need to compensate for this at the behest of civilization is what drives them to their immense expenditure of mental energy, end quote. I suspect that the ableist character of contemporary society could have something to do with the immense expenditure of mental energy as well, but clearly this was not Freud's position. However, Freud's neurotics are described in quite similar terms compared to Bloyler's schizophrenics exhibiting forms of autistic thinking. Both are characterized as withdrawing from the real social world towards a world of fantasy, where desires are conceivable as already fulfilled. The asociality of the neurotic and of the schizophrenic, which closely reminds us of the centrality of isolation in the subsequent works on autism as a separate independent condition by Kanner and Asperger, also recalls common representation of the child as well as of the savage. After all, this idea of the savage as lonely and content in his loneliness, self-sufficient, pre-social, or even asocial, was common in Europe, at least since Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And such autistic character, although Freud clearly does not employ this term, this autistic character of schizophrenics and neurotics is thus identified as a feature of an earlier stage of human evolution, both ontogenetically, the child, and phylogenetically, the primitive man. That is, I already said it, as a feature which is proper of children and savages. Hence, the already highlighted tendency to compare such features with mythical thought, with dimension of fantasy and animism, and this idea of magic. In this regard, it is worth noting that also not making references to this dimension or to these terms, Kanner has recorded with great attention the tendency of the autistic children he observed to be more interested in objects than in people, and to treat inanimate objects as if they were animated, something which recalls important anthropological categories of the time, which were usually applied to non-European people, such as animism, as said, and fetishism. But indeed, he does not openly make this connection, but still, I think that it's significant equally. Now, in this sense, this identification was also central in the work of another pillar of modern psychopathology, that is Jean Piaget. Piaget, in his psychoanalysis in its relations with child psychology, wrote that, quote, psychoanalysis is concerned not only with dreams, but with all forms of thoughts that are not strictly logical and objective. It is an inextricable network of symbol associations whose only logic is that of the emotions. It is the thought of the child, of the neurotic, of the dreamer, of the artist, of the mystic. It has also been studied by Lévi-Bruhl under the name of prelogical thought, of which the principal characteristic among primitive people is its fusion with magic, once again. However, it should be remarked that Lévi-Bruhl, who is referenced here by Piaget, has always openly refused to compare children and non-European people, although writing a study titled The Primitive Mind. However, symbolism and magic are thus interpreted as different expressions of the same form of thought, governed by the laws of the dream, of the unconscious. And the name of this form of thought is, Piaget wrote, following Bloyler's usage, autistic thought. Furthermore, in the essay The Child's Conception of Physical Causality, even more explicitly, he writes that, quote, magic and autism are therefore two different sides of one and the same phenomenon, that confusion between the self and the world, which destroys both logical truth and objective existence, end quote. Piaget furthermore appears to share Bloiler's thesis according to which autistic thought will not be a feature pertaining only to earlier stages of human evolution, but its role in the mind would change accordingly with historical and developmental coordinates, both ontogenetically and phylogenetically. He wrote about this point. Now, autistic thought, creator of personal symbols, remains essential in each of us throughout his life. Its role changes with age. In the child, autism is everything. Later, reason develops at its expense. So clearly, the identification of autism, of autistic thinking, as a stage in the normal development of the human mind, clearly bears some impact, some effect on the representation of autistic and neurodivergent people in a broad sense as blocked in an earlier stage of evolution and or of individual development. So a triangular relationship continues to exist between these three figures, the child, the non-European, and the idiot, as Locke wrote. Whereas the latter is increasingly identified by the presence of forms of autistic thought. I quote again from Piaget, and more exactly from Judgment and Reasoning in the Child. Quote, "It is therefore our belief," I think I must change my slide, yeah. "It is therefore our belief that the day will come when child thought will be placed on the same level in relation to adult, normal, civilized thought. As primitive mentality as defined by Lévi-Bruhl, as autistic and symbolical thought as described by Freud and his disciples, and as morbid consciousness in the event of this last concept, which we owe to M.C.H. Blondel, being eventually identified with the former." And we find, again, this triangular relationship perfectly stated, because it is compared to adult, normal, civilized, the exact opposite of child, idiot, and savage. Such forms of thought, the autistic thought, are all associated in being described as asocial or presocial in accordance with the very definition of autism given by Piaget. That is, the absence of detachment between thought and the ego, corresponding to the first stage of development of the child in Piaget's system. They are thus described as incommunicable, personal, individual, private, and monologic, all traits that we find very often also in diagnostic handbooks, and still very much in stereotypical representations of autistic people. It is not difficult, I think, to see how these sets of assumptions have been somehow conserved, therefore, although in different terms during the first years of the process of the historical constitution of autism as a separate and independent condition. Nevertheless, I realized that one could legitimately think that these sets of assumptions have later disappeared, and that the contemporary category of autism has barely something in common with this seemingly distant history and debate. So in the last section of this presentation, I will refer to some very recent research in neurosciences mainly, and I will try to argue that the opposite is true. So I have given some bibliographical references here. At first glance, the features associated with the concept of autism that I have discussed so far, are believed to have disappeared with the beginning of the hegemony of behaviorism as a psychological school in the 60s. As a matter of fact, from that time until the 80s, etiological theories of autism have been dominantly psychogenic. Bruno Bettelheim's theory of autism, largely discredited, obviously, which was infamously known as the refrigerator mother theory, reduced the origin of autism as a condition to the individual relationship between the child and the parents, especially the mother, as the name of the theory suggests, and was thus structurally incompatible with the complex sets of assumptions centered upon the analogy between ontogenesis and phylogenesis described before. Conversely, today, it is widely recognized that the origin of autism is genetic and corresponds to a different functioning of the brain compared to the neurotypical one. At the same time, the advancement of the neurodiversity paradigm, although still far from being hegemonic, importantly promoted by many autistic peoples and neurodivergent peoples, more generally movements, is contributing to produce a positive and non-pathologizing view of autism itself as a condition, as well known. However, much research has been conducted in the last few years with the aim of identifying the exact genetic and neurological causes of autism. It is precisely in this interdisciplinary context, perhaps surprisingly, that the atavistic characterization of autism and neurodivergence more broadly has made its full reappearance. So, first of all, as I mentioned scatteredly throughout the presentation, it should be noted that autism is not the only form of neurodivergence to which these schemes are applied. It is just a more ancient category in this sense. All people not recognized as neurotypical are potentially subject to this kind of description and representation. Although in the authors I considered previously said the concept of autism as a particular centrality in the triangular relationship within early psychopathology. For instance, however, attempts were made at the end of the 90s to explain ADHD in atavistic terms. The hunter versus farmer hypothesis, formulated at the end of the 90s by Thom Hartmann, certainly aimed to propose a non-pathologizing view of ADHD people, but at the same time identified them as endowed with hunter-gatherers' minds, that is, in that construction, premodern minds. And the hypothesis implied that ADHD traits had been evolutionarily advantageous in hunter-gatherer prehistoric societies, and that they have instead become disadvantageous in farmer societies. So despite the intentions of the proposer, such a hypothesis thus represents ADHD people as a past in the present, again, as living remnants of earlier stages of human evolution within the field of evolutionary psychology. The hypothesis was furthermore widened by subsequent research. In the slide, I have left some references. And until recent times, although terms like evolutionary mismatch are now preferred. And it was even applied to the study of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, showing, if needed, once again, how these are themselves considered as forms of past in the present, living fossils, which can be used to understand human prehistory as if they were not our contemporaries. So, returning to autism, very similar hypothesis is similar to the hunter-gatherer versus farmer hypothesis can be found. The closest is probably the so-called solitary forager hypothesis, which was proposed by Jared E. Reiser in 2011. And according to which, also on the basis of comparison with other animal species, again, the fourth line of the triangular relationship, autistic traits were interpreted in this theory as evolutionarily advantageous for foragers living alone, solitary foragers, perhaps forced by ecological circumstances to live alone. But the scheme of the hypothesis is basically the same as the hunter versus farmer hypothesis, which is actually openly cited as a model by Reiser. Once again, evolutionarily advantageous traits would have become disadvantageous and pathologic in new environments, and autistic individuals would be made accordingly forms of past in the present in a clear atavistic representation of them, of us. However, representations of this kind can be found in different forms of contemporary research as well. For example, language issues in autistic people have been tentatively explained based on the absence or attenuation of what is defined as domesticated traits in the autistic brain. This is the other paper I put here, language impairments in ASD resulting from a failed domestication of the human brain. Failed domestication is quite an interesting concept in this sense, I'd say. And based on this paper, genes involved in the self-domestication process of human beings would appear to be dysregulated in autistic people, as also evidenced by the fact that, I quote from the article, some features of the ASD phenotype can be found or expected to be found in wild primates. So once again, we found this further comparison, but now in the new and civilized language of neurosciences. Some aspects of brain development in autistic people would thus exhibit, according to this study, the persistence of archaic features previously disappeared in the normal development of modern human beings, and thus again atavistic in character. However, for the purpose of the present discourse, it is perhaps even more representative to consider the various versions of what is commonly known, it's also been famous on the internet for a while, as autistic Neanderthal theory, which have been assumed along different strains of research with analogous results to the other theories I discussed so far, in terms of the representation of autistic people. It has been argued that autistic traits have developed in Homo neanderthalensis, later passing into the modern Homo sapiens through interbreeding, and that, quote, the article is titled Hominins and the Emergence of the Modern Human Brain, quote, differences between Homo neanderthalensis and recent anatomically modern Homo sapiens in brain morphology and cognition have parallels in the differences between autistic versus neurotypical individuals, end quote. Clearly, the point here is not whether it is true or not that autistic traits' evolutionary history has something to do with the lineage of Homo neanderthalensis, which, if true, would be also fascinating in my opinion. However, it's also been said about Tuscan people, so I would feel implied anyway in this kind of hypothesis concerning Homo neanderthalensis. However, the point is how this fit within the history of the atavistic representation of autism reconstructed so far. So, as a matter of fact, the same article, this one, Hominins and the Emergence of the Modern Human Brain. Yes, I wanted to briefly read also another passage from here because it is even more explicit than the last one. It says, autism, a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by impaired social interaction for which a clinical definition is ongoing, and thank you very much, is referenced in studies of fossil hominin brain structure and function, either as an analogy for developmental differences between closely related species or as a potentially atavistic indication of actual primitive phenotypes. And they use the word, so it's perfect. I was very happy under some aspects when I found this passage because it showed me that I was right at the same time. It's a terrible passage, so I was not that happy, but still. As I was saying, this article was also, which I remember was published in 2012, so it's really, really recent, the opposite is true. This article refers to another one published in 1998 titled CAPPE Autism and the Evolution of the Human Mind, which is a promising title from this point of view. It was written by a neuropsychologist, Nicholas Humphrey, who, in order to substantiate the thesis for which the prehistoric authors of cave paintings and engravings, quote, may actually have had distinctly premodern minds, have been little given to symbolic thought, have had no great interest in communication, and have been essentially self-taught and untrained, end quote, compared then to the artwork of an autistic girl studied by Lorna Selfe in the 70s. This study was published in the 1977 with the title Nadia, a case of extraordinary drawing ability in an autistic child. Again, in Humphrey's words, remarkable similarities between the cave paintings and Nadia's should, in the opinion of Humphrey, be taken to be proof positive that the cave artist's mind were essentially premodern. This is a phrase taken from the article initially. Although he specifies that he did not want to argue that, quote, Nadia was some kind of a throwback to the Ice Age, end quote, the line of reasoning clearly is that her, quote again, undeveloped language, impoverished cognitive skills, apparent lack of interest in communication, and absence of artistic training, end quote, make Nadia, in fact, a contemporary example of a pre-modern mind, a living fossil, yet another form of past in the present. He uses the term living fossil. Humphrey considers her case and prehistoric cave art is so close that he hypothesizes that the disappearance of cave art was caused by the development of language, and thus of the modern mind, he says. Exactly like the acquisition of language around the age of 8 caused a partial loss of drawing skills for Nadia. So once again, exactly as we said, as we've seen in Locke, not only this triangular relationship remains and continuous references between these different figures continues to exist, but they continue to be used to explain each other. Humphrey really thinks that he can use an autistic girl born in the 70s to explain cave art in human prehistory. So it's serious. It was published on the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, not in the bulletin of my neighborhood. So, well, however, I'll conclude saying that it is possible to see that the analogy between phylogenesis and ontogenesis is clearly not only still alive after 2 centuries, but also extremely influential on current research. The development of language at the species level and at the individual level is read exactly in the same terms by Humphrey. And furthermore, this triangular relationship is once again reaffirmed, as said, because, as I mentioned, a young autistic girl can be used according to this scheme as a living model to understand our prehistoric ancestors, and perhaps also, as did by Piaget, to understand modern hunter-gatherer societies, for example. So in these terms, I believe that the necessity to provincialize neurotypicality I indicated as a scope of this research at the beginning of the presentation appears more urgent than ever. And we among the many things we need, we certainly need to fight against this kind of representations. And I have finished. I hope I was in the time. Sorry, I did not exceed with time, and I'll be glad to hear from you if you have questions, if you have comments, and so on. I hope I've been clear, and sorry for the many quotations.